They said it was just another storm in the Bitterroot Range. But when a lone ranger stumbled across a half-buried Mustang mare, heavy with foal and scarred by rope, she knew this was no ordinary rescue. What the snow was hiding went far beyond one horse's survival. Because as the night deepened, the Mustang began to lead her toward a secret buried in the mountains, a secret powerful enough to shake an entire community and prove that some guardians don't come with badges or guns, but with hooves. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Bitterroot Range in western Montana had a way of turning cruel without warning. Winter here was not a season, but a force, an old predator that bared its teeth each time the sky went dark. That night, a blizzard howled through the mountain valleys, swallowing whole ridgelines beneath a torrent of ice and snow. Wind shrieked like a living thing rushing down the slopes in furious currents, flinging flakes sideways until they stung like glass. Tall ponderosa pines bent and groaned under the weight of the storm, their limbs cracking like gunshots in the night. Visibility was nothing. A world of white pressed against the windshield of the forest green Ford Ranger, creeping its way along the back road. The wipers clawed frantically, but could not keep pace with the sleet. The tires fitted with chains clanked and ground against the ice-slick pavement, climbing steadily higher into the range. Inside the cab, the radio hissed static, punctuated by the clipped voice of dispatch, repeating the same warning: winter storm advisory upgraded to level 3. All main routes closed until further notice. Most rangers would have turned back, but Sierra Cole was not most rangers. 31 years old, she had grown up in these mountains, daughter of a cowboy father and a mother who'd worn the same ranger badge she now carried on her chest. The job had been her inheritance, her calling. She knew the backcountry the way others knew city streets. The mountain ridges, the deer trails, the smell of the wind before a storm. These were her compass points. Tonight, her jaw was set tight, shoulders hunched in her heavy canvas coat as she kept the truck steady around a narrow bend. Her dark hair was pulled into a braid tucked under her beanie, her brown eyes fixed on the next curve of the road. She was calm, though anyone watching would have seen the fatigue etched across her face. There were shadows under her eyes lines that came not from age, but from memories she rarely let surface. She lived alone now in a small cabin near Falcon Ridge. Solitude was easier than conversation. Her friends had learned not to ask why she never talked about the wildfire 3 years ago, the one that had taken her horse, the only companion who had carried her through her rookie years as a ranger. That loss had burned deeper than the flames themselves, a wound she still carried like a hidden scar. So when the storms came, Sierra did what she always did: she drove. She patrolled the forgotten roads, checked trailheads, made sure no hikers or hunters had been foolish enough to wander too far. It wasn't duty alone. It was the way she kept from drowning in silence. She glanced at the radio again as the dispatcher's voice repeated the closure notice. "Yeah, I know," she muttered under her breath. "Doesn't change what's out here." The Ford Ranger growled up another slope, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the storm. Outside, the world was nothing but white fury. It was near the stretch of road locals called High Lantern, a sharp curve along a sheer drop that Sierra first heard it. At first, it was only the storm, the endless screaming of wind, the brittle snap of branches, the dull roar of snow moving like surf across the mountain. Then beneath it all, something different. A sound thin and raw carried on the gale. She slowed the truck, frowning. Maybe just a tree creaking, maybe nothing. Then it came again. Not the cry of a coyote, not the moan of timber. A fractured sound, high-pitched and broken like a strangled whistle. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She killed the engine, plunging the cab into a silence so heavy that even the storm seemed to hold its breath. The headlights dimmed as she twisted them off. For a moment, there was only darkness and the hammering of wind against metal. Sierra cracked her door open. The storm shoved its way in, immediately a slap of icy air cutting across her face. Snowflakes seared her skin like needles. She pulled her collar higher and stepped out into the storm. The sound came again. This time she recognized it, a whinny faint and uneven, muffled by snow. A horse. Sierra's boots sank into the drift with a crunch. She grabbed her flashlight from the truck and swept its beam across the white. The light carved thin tunnels through the swirling flakes. She moved slowly, listening, following the broken cries. The road curved away into darkness. On the slope below, the beam caught something, a mound in the snow that wasn't quite part of the landscape. Darker, misshapen. It moved. Her breath caught. She slid down the embankment snow, swallowing her shins, until she stood at the base of a twisted pine. There, half buried in snow and trembling with exhaustion, was a horse. It was a Mustang mare coat, once silver gray, now matted with blood and ice. Her flanks heaved, belly swollen with full sides twitching from the cold. One hind leg lay twisted at an awkward angle, stiff with blood. Her back was glazed with frost, as though she had been lying there for hours. Sierra's chest tightened. She had seen wild Mustangs before, small herds wandering the Bitterroot foothills, but never like this. Never broken and discarded. The mare's eyes cracked open at the intrusion of light. They were wide, but not panicked, dulled with exhaustion, reflecting a depth of pain Sierra knew too well. There was no fight left, only a silent plea. Sierra crouched, scanning the body. Rope marks scored deep into the skin around the neck. The hide along her knees was rubbed raw blood, dried in jagged streaks. The hooves were chipped and split, as if she had run until she could run no more. Not a simple accident. This horse had been hunted. "Easy, girl," Sierra whispered, lowering the flashlight so its beam was softer. She extended a hand palm open. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The mare gave no resistance as Sierra reached for her scarf, dipped it in snow, and gently wiped the ice from her eyes. A slow blink. No flinch, no fight. Just a weary acceptance. For a long moment, the storm seemed to fade. There was only Sierra crouched in the snow, and the Mustang meeting her gaze. She knew if she left the animal here, the cold would finish what exhaustion had started. The mare had maybe an hour left too at most. Sierra stood scanning the slope. The truck waited above its shape, barely visible through the snow. She clenched her jaw. This was going to be hell. She scrambled back up, yanked open the truck bed, spread out a tarp and a heavy blanket, then returned with a length of climbing rope. "You're not dying out here," she murmured as she worked. "Not tonight." The mare stirred weakly as Sierra looped the rope into a makeshift sling around the forelegs. It took all of Sierra's strength to lever the animal upward, coaxing her into standing just long enough to half walk, half drag her toward the incline. Each step was a battle. The mare stumbled, collapsed, struggled to rise again. "Come on, girl. One more step. You can do it." Snow soaked through Sierra's gloves. Her arms burned from effort, breath tearing from her lungs in ragged gasps. But slowly, impossibly, they reached the truck. With a final grunt, Sierra guided the mare into the bed, piling blankets over her shivering body. Inside the cab, Sierra cranked the heater. She turned to check the animal through the rear window. The mare lay still, chest rising shallowly. "You made it," Sierra whispered. She reached back, brushed damp hair from her forehead, then looked at the horse again. Something about the resilience in those eyes, even dulled by exhaustion, struck her. "Aurora," Sierra said softly, testing the word. "Yeah, that fits." The name clung to the air, fragile and luminous, like the northern lights themselves, a promise of light in the darkest storm. The truck rumbled back onto the road, crawling toward Bears Hollow Station 9 miles away. Sierra kept glancing into the mirror. Each time she looked, she swore the mare's ears twitched as though listening. Halfway down the pass, the horse stirred. Her eyes flicked open, ears pinning back. She shifted against the blanket's hooves, scraping faintly. Sierra frowned. "Easy, Aurora. It's just the ride." But the horse wasn't reacting to the truck. She was alert, tense, staring past Sierra toward the blackness beyond the road. The storm had eased, snow falling softer now, but a chill crept down Sierra's spine. She checked her mirrors again. Nothing but swirling flakes. Still, Aurora's unease was unmistakable. The mare's body trembled not from cold, but from something else, memory or fear of what lingered out there. Sierra tightened her grip on the wheel. "It's over now," she said firmly, though a part of her wondered if it was true. The snow thinned as the Ranger wound its way down the pass, but Sierra knew the storm had only just begun for both of them. The storm had not eased by the time Sierra guided the truck off the main track and onto the narrow service road. Snow cascaded from the boughs above, breaking over the cab in showers of white. The headlights cut through the blizzard like blades, revealing only fleeting glimpses of the familiar trail to Bears Hollow Station. It was a road she could have driven blindfolded, but tonight it felt like threading a needle through a moving wall of ice. Finally, the squat outline of the Ranger's cabin emerged through the storm. Its roof bowed under weight, the chimney already half buried in drifting snow. The little building, no larger than a one-room schoolhouse, had stood for 50 winters, weathering storms and lightning strikes. Tonight it looked battered but enduring, like a soldier bracing against a siege. Sierra eased the truck to a stop. She killed the engine's silence, collapsing around her, except for the relentless moan of the wind. For a moment, she just sat there, palms resting on the steering wheel, letting the heater's warmth fade from her cheeks. Then she looked back at the shape in the truck bed. Aurora still lay curled beneath the blanket's sides, heaving in shallow breaths. Her ears twitched at Sierra's movement, but she did not lift her head. "You're still with me," Sierra whispered more to herself than to the mare. "Hang on, girl." She climbed out into the storm. Snow swallowed her boots up to the ankles as she crossed to the cabin porch. The steps had vanished beneath a drift. She had to dig through with her hands to reach the door handle. The tin roof groaned under a gust of wind ice, sloughing off in sheets. The lock gave after a twist, and Sierra shoved the door inward. Cold air rushed into the dark, empty room. She fumbled with matches at the old stone hearth, stacking pine logs in a pyramid, coaxing sparks into flame. At first, the fire resisted smoke curling up the chimney, as if uncertain it could rise against the storm. Then it caught, and a wash of orange light bloomed across the cabin walls. The room warmed by increments. The cabin smelled of pine resin and dust. Shadows danced across the timber walls, and for the first time that night, Sierra felt the faintest echo of shelter. She returned to the truck, tugged at the rope she had looped across Aurora's chest, and coaxed the mare down the tailgate. Aurora staggered, nearly falling to her knees, but managed to stay upright. Sierra tightened her grip, sliding an arm beneath the horse's neck for balance. "You're stronger than you look," Sierra murmured. "Come on, just a little further." They crossed the threshold into the cabin. Sierra had spread blankets and tarps near the fire. Aurora stumbled once, then collapsed onto the bedding, breath rasping but steady. The mare's flanks rose and fell in quick, shallow motion. Sierra knelt, pulling off her gloves. Her fingers were stiff, but she worked quickly, drawing water from the kettle she had set, above the flame, soaking a rag and wiping the dried blood from Aurora's hind leg. The wound was shallow, but angry edges crusted. She dabbed antiseptic from the ranger's med kit, the sting making the horse twitch. "You'll forgive me for that," Sierra muttered. "Better angry now than gone by mourning." She finished cleaning and stepped back, surveying the mare. The horse's eyes had half closed, head tilted toward the warmth of the fire. Sierra turned to the radio, bolted to the wall. She adjusted the dial, pressing the call switch. Static burst, then a faint channel cut through. "This is Ranger Sierra Cole," she said, voice brisk. "I've got an injured Mustang, pregnant, dehydrated. Urgent assistance requested." The transmission crackled, fading in and out, but the message went. She exhaled and set the receiver down. Now all she could do was wait. It was nearly an hour later when the knock came. Sierra almost didn't hear it over the storm. A second knock followed, sharper, and she was on her feet. She pulled the door open against the wind and found Dr. Naomi Fletcher standing there, bundled in a long coat, snow-caked to her boots. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder, and a headlamp glowed against her hat brim. Her breath came out in white plumes. "Where is she?" Naomi asked, not wasting a word. Sierra stepped aside, and Naomi strode in, setting the satchel on the floor near the fire. She crouched at Aurora's side, slipping the stethoscope into her ears. She pressed it against the mare's chest, listening for long seconds. Then she moved to the belly, pressing gently with one hand, watching the horse's flinch and twitch of ears. Finally, she lifted the hind legs, shining her headlamp along the wound. Naomi's face remained calm, but her voice carried certainty. "She's dehydrated. Infection in the leg, but not deep yet. She's got life left and at least one foal still kicking." Aurora shifted faintly at the touch eyes, flickering open. Naomi tapped the mare's shoulder lightly. "She's tough. Damn tough." Sierra let out a slow breath. "I wasn't sure she'd make it this far." "She'll make it," Naomi said, "because you got her here." They worked side by side. Naomi prepared an IV line, sliding the needle deftly into a vein. The mare jerked once, but then settled, eyes darting towards Sierra. The ranger knelt by her head, hand resting on the warm, trembling neck. "It's all right," Sierra whispered. "You're safe now." Naomi paused in her work, studying the horse, not with a clinician's eye, but with something more personal. She tilted her head. Notice her stance, even half dead. She holds herself like a queen. Sierra frowned. "What do you mean, her neck carriage?" The way she scans the room without panic. "Look at her hooves, see that wear? That's the stride of a led mare. The herd follows horses like this. Strong, intuitive. She wasn't just caught, she was hunted." The words landed heavy. Sierra looked at Aurora again. It wasn't just survival in those eyes. There was memory. "You're sure?" Naomi nodded. "I've seen it before. Not many like her, but when you do, you don't forget." Sierra's hand tightened on the rope at Aurora's chest. A led mare, a hunted queen of the range. This wasn't just about one horse clinging to life. This was about something larger, something someone wanted to erase. The IV drip continued fluid, easing into Aurora's system. Her breathing slowed, steadier now, though exhaustion still weighed her down. She shifted her head, and in the flickering light of the fire, her gaze locked on Sierra's. The moment stretched. It wasn't submission in that look, nor fear. It was something else, recognition, agreement, as if the mare had chosen to acknowledge her. Sierra held her eyes, and something in her chest shifted. She had lost Jasper in fire, had told herself she wouldn't risk caring for another. Yet here, half frozen in a blizzard, was a bond she couldn't deny. Naomi noticed. She leaned back on her heels, a voice quiet. "Looks like she's already picked you." Sierra gave a faint, incredulous laugh. "I didn't volunteer for that." "You don't get to choose," Naomi said with a ghost of a smile. Sierra reached out, fingers brushing the thick mane still damp from melted snow. "If she made it through that storm, I'm not letting her go back to the dark." Aurora sighed, eyelids lowering. She leaned her head against the wooden wall, muscles easing for the first time since Sierra had found her. Naomi rose, pouring steaming water into tin mugs from the kettle. She handed one to Sierra, then looked down at the mare. Her voice carried the weight of conviction, low and certain. "You may have just found the reason you were out there tonight." Sierra lifted the mug, steam rising to her face, eyes never leaving the mare by the fire. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like an empty shelter. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Morning came slowly to the Bitterroot Range. The storm had weakened, though the land still lay smothered beneath a thick crust of snow. The sun struggled to break through a pale smear behind shifting clouds, throwing little warmth. The world glittered with ice, brittle and unforgiving, as though the storm had turned every tree into glass. Sierra had not slept much. She'd spent most of the night tending Aurora, listening to the mare's shallow breaths beside the fire. At some point near dawn, Aurora had stirred and stretched out on her side, no longer trembling, the rise and fall of her ribs steadier than before. Sierra had taken that as a fragile victory and allowed herself a single hour of rest in the chair by the hearth. The sound of tires crunching outside brought her awake. She pulled on her coat, stepped to the window, and saw a battered county-issued pickup nosing into the station clearing. The truck was old, its bed-rusted paint dulled by years of Montana winters. On the driver's side door, the faded lettering still spelled out Ravalli County Sheriff's Department. Sierra's stomach tightened as the driver climbed out. Sheriff Hank Danner, age written in the lines around his eyes, his shoulders thick beneath a heavy wool coat. 52, a man who had spent half his life chasing drunks out of roadside bars and answering domestic calls in town. He was competent in his way, but careful to the point of suspicion. The door creaked as he stepped into the cabin, stomping snow from his boots. He looked around once, taking in the fire, the scattered medical supplies, and finally the sight of Aurora curled on the blankets near the hearth. Danner's brows drew together. Hell of a storm to find a Mustang. His voice was low, skeptical. "You sure she just wandered into the snow?" Sierra set her mug on the table, calm but firm. "She didn't wander. She was running." The sheriff squinted, stepping closer to study the horse. His gaze lingered on the raw indentation circling Aurora's neck, the unmistakable scar of rope. He clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Wild horses don't just collapse in a storm," he muttered. Sierra crossed her arms. "Then you know as well as I do, somebody put her there." For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of firewood and the steady drip of melted snow from his coat onto the cabin floor. Danner exhaled slowly, then jerked his chin toward the door. "Show me where you found her." The Ford Ranger led Danner's truck, following behind. By mid-morning, they reached the bend near High Lantern, the place Sierra would not soon forget. The storm had covered much of the ground in fresh powder, but Sierra's instincts pointed unerringly to the slope where she'd slid down into the drifts the night before. She climbed out, boots sinking deep. Danner followed, carrying a short-handled spade. Together they pushed through the snow, Sierra guiding him with gestures. Here, she was half buried against that pine. The sheriff planted the spade and shoved hard. Snow gave way to a different texture, a packed rut pressed deep into the frozen mud below. Danner crouched, brushing clear the edges with gloved hands. Not a car, he said. Too wide. Dual axles. Heavy load. Sierra crouched beside him, studying the parallel lines. A livestock hauler. They moved farther along the slope. Danner's eyes narrowed as the shovel struck metal. He scraped harder, and the shape emerged. A heavy iron cage half collapsed its door, bent at the hinges, as if torn open from within. Rust coated its bars, and here and there, strands of coarse mane clung where an animal had rubbed or fought. Dark stains crusted the snow nearby, blood long frozen. Someone kept her locked up, Danner said, his voice grim. Either she fought her way out, or they didn't bother hauling her back. Sierra crouched at the cage, fingers brushing something caught against the hinge, a rope frayed and stiff. At the end of it clung a piece of red nylon, bright even against the snow. She held it up. This isn't range rope. This is cargo tie-down, industrial. A gust of wind swept across the ridge. In the distance, Sierra noticed a scatter of hoof prints leading into the trees. Not random, the marks of multiple horses clustered, then scattered as though driven in panic. She turned back. This wasn't just her. There was a herd. Danner didn't answer at once. He snapped a photo of the cage with his phone, and then another of the tracks. He pulled a GPS unit from his pocket, marking coordinates. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened. "I don't like this," he said. "Smells like someone was herding wild horses." Sierra's mouth tightened. "And they lost her. Or left her," Danner replied. His tone carried no comfort. By early afternoon, they were back in Darby. The sheriff's office sat on the corner of Main Street, its windows still frosted, the flag on its pole stiff in the winter wind. Inside the station smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. Sierra brushed snow from her coat as she followed Danner into the records room. At the table already sat Dr. Naomi Fletcher, arms folded, glasses perched low on her nose. She had come in from the veterinary clinic, curious and determined to see what the sheriff uncovered. Danner pulled a stack of manila folders from the cabinet, slapping them onto the table. Community reports. Past 2 months. Naomi leaned forward. "I've been filing some of these myself. Folks calling about missing bands along the South Trails." They spread the reports out. 6 separate accounts of wild horses seen one day and gone the next. Another 3 notes from farmers on the outskirts, horses bolting through fields in the night eyes, rolling too frightened to stop even for feed. Sierra studied the wall map, the sheriff pinning each location with a red tack. She stepped back. A pattern began to emerge. All of them, Sierra said slowly, cluster near the service roads, places a truck could reach without being noticed. Naomi pointed, and all of them far from ranch houses. Whoever's behind this knew where to hunt without being seen. The room fell into silence. The map now looked less like random points and more like a trail, a snare tightening around the Bitterroot Range. Sierra crossed her arms, voice steady. "This is organized." Danner didn't deny it. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, eyes still on the map. "Wait," Danner muttered, digging through another folder. There was one more report. He pulled out a handwritten note. "Linda Mayer. Works nights at the Sinclair station 12 miles east." He scanned the page. She logged something strange. Naomi raised a brow. Strange how Danner read aloud, "White truck. No plates. Parked behind the station at 3 a.m. Cab torn on the inside. Driver never got out." Sierra leaned closer. "Anything else?" "Yeah." Danner flipped the page. She said she heard thumping from the trailer, like hooves. But then silence, as if someone calmed them quick. The three exchanged glances. Sierra whispered almost to herself, "They're not just moving horses. They're hiding them." Naomi's jaw tightened. If they're holding them that long, it's not for sale at auction. It's something darker. The sheriff closed the file slowly, his reflection dim in the glass window beside them. His expression was heavier than before his eyes shadowed. For the first time, the weight of what they were up against pressed into the room like another storm approaching. Danner finally looked up, voice low. "If we follow this trail, we'd better be ready for what we find." Sierra's gaze hardened, meeting his without flinching. "We don't have a choice." The storm had broken. By the following night, the world outside Bears Hollow Station was transformed. The blizzard that had raged with such fury now lay silent, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in white. Snow draped the pines like heavy cloaks and blanketed the clearing in layers so thick it swallowed fence posts whole. The air was sharp and still carrying the crisp bite of mountain cold, but none of the violence that had dominated the night Sierra first found Aurora. The only sound was the occasional creak of ice splitting from a branch or the distant crack of a shifting drift. Inside the ranger's cabin, the fire in the old stone hearth burned steadily, throwing out a glow that softened the log walls. The scent of smoke and pine resin clung to the air. Sierra knelt near Aurora, carefully rewrapping the mare's hind leg with clean bandages. The wound was healing slowly under Naomi's regimen of antiseptics and fluids, though infection still hovered as a threat. Sierra was focused on her task, head bent, when she felt Aurora's body stiffen beneath her hands. The mare stretched her neck long, her breath coming harder. Her flanks twitched as though a shiver ran the length of her spine. Sierra's head snapped up. She saw beads of sweat forming along the horse's neck despite the cold air. Aurora's front legs shifted restlessly, hooves scraping the floorboards. Her wide eyes flashed white for a moment, nostrils flaring. Sierra whispered, "Easy, girl." But her chest tightened with recognition. This wasn't panic. This was labor. She dropped the roll of bandage and lunged for the radio mounted near the door. Static buzzed when she pressed the transmitter. "Naomi, it's Sierra. I think she's starting. I need you back here now." The line crackled, and then Naomi's steady voice came through, though muffled by distance and interference. "Stay calm. Don't touch her unless she's in danger. I'll be there as fast as I can." It took nearly 30 minutes, though it felt longer. Sierra tried to steady her breathing, crouching near Aurora's head. The mare had lowered herself awkwardly onto her sides, heaving with the effort of contractions. Every so often, a low moan rose from her chest, a sound so raw it pressed against Sierra's ribs. When headlights finally cut across the clearing, Sierra nearly sagged in relief. Moments later, the cabin door banged open, and Dr. Naomi Fletcher entered, dusted with snow, her breath fogging. Her hair was damp from melted flake strands of gray catching in the firelight. She dropped her heavy coat by the door and swung her medical satchel onto the floor. "Where is she?" she asked, though her eyes were already on the mare. Aurora let out another groan, legs shifting. Naomi was at her side in seconds, slipping on gloves, pulling towels and instruments from her bag. She knelt, hand pressed lightly against Aurora's abdomen, feeling the ripple of muscle. "She's in active labor." Naomi confirmed, her voice calm, but clipped. She glanced at Sierra. "Listen to me. We don't intervene unless we absolutely have to. Let her lead, we just support." Sierra nodded, kneeling closer to Aurora's head again. She ran her hand along the damp fur of the mare's neck, whispering, "I'm right here, girl. You've got this." The contractions grew stronger, rolling through Aurora in waves. She groaned, legs straining against the blankets, sweat darkening the fur along her shoulders. Sierra wiped her forehead gently with a damp cloth, murmuring constant reassurance. Outside, the wind slid low through the trees, whispering against the cabin walls. Inside, every creak of wood and hiss of flame seemed amplified, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Minutes passed, each one stretching. Then Naomi leaned closer, her voice low. "We're getting close." See the sack. Sierra's throat tightened. The translucent bulge appeared briefly glistening in the firelight, before retreating with another contraction. She pressed her palm to Aurora's cheek, her own eyes damp. Images of Jasper, the horse she had lost to fire, flickered unbidden in her memory. The helplessness of that night, the ash, the silence after. Not again, she swore silently. Not this time. Aurora heaved with another contraction, neck-arched, nostrils flaring. Then, with a long, guttural cry, her body convulsed, and a small, glistening shape slipped free onto the blankets. Naomi moved quickly, tearing open the sack with practiced hands, wiping the foal's nose and mouth. For one terrible heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, a fragile gasp, followed by a thin, high-pitched whinny that filled the cabin like the first light of dawn. Sierra's breath broke into a laugh that was half a sob. "That's it. That's it, little one." Aurora, exhausted but fierce, dragged herself closer, licking the foal's damp coat with a trembling tongue. Her eyes, heavy with fatigue, never left her newborn. Sierra leaned closer, voice shaking. "Welcome to the world, little one." The fire cracked softly. Outside, moonlight glanced off the snow. Inside, the cabin held only the sound of a newborn's breathing and the tender rasp of a mother's touch. For a time, neither woman spoke. The foal shifted weakly against its mother's belly, each small movement a triumph. Naomi busied herself checking vitals, jotting notes with her steady precision. Sierra remained at Aurora's head, brushing sweat-soaked strands of mane from her eyes. But Aurora did not relax. Even as her breathing slowed and the foal settled, her ears flicked constantly. Her head lifted, turning again and again toward the window. Every faint crack outside, an ice shard falling, a branch settling, made her muscles tighten. Naomi noticed too. She set aside her clipboard and said softly, "That's not fear. She's alert to something, looking for someone, or something." Sierra frowned, watching the mare's restless movements. Aurora's eyes, deep and intent, shifted from Sierra to the window and back again, as though trying to convey meaning. Sierra rose and crossed to the frosted glass. She pushed open the curtain slightly. The storm had left the sky clear. A pale moon glowed above the ridgeline, painting the snow in shades of silver. Pines stood in silent rows. Nothing moved. And yet, Sierra felt it too, an absence, a wrongness, as though something was missing from the scene. She whispered, "Is this what you're telling me, girl? That you're not whole because the herd isn't here?" Behind her, Aurora nickered softly, head turning once more toward the darkness of the forest. Back inside, Sierra lowered herself onto the floor near the hearth, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Naomi sat at the table, jotting notes in her ledger, heart rate, temperature, the foal's first breath. Sierra stared into the fire. Her voice was quiet but heavy with realization. She didn't just survive out there. She came from somewhere. She left something behind. Naomi looked up, eyes reflecting the flicker of flame. And she's trying to bring us back to it. Sierra fell silent. The words struck deep. Until now, she had thought of Aurora as a single life to be saved, a miraculous survivor. But the truth was larger. This mare was a messenger, a bridge to something hidden in the wilderness. She rose and crossed to Aurora again. The mare lifted her head slightly, watching with calm intensity. Sierra crouched down, resting her hand on the damp curve of Aurora's neck. Her voice was steady, filled with a conviction she hadn't felt in years. "If there's a trail, we'll follow it, I promise." Aurora exhaled a long, weary sigh and lowered her head at last onto the wooden floor. Her eyes drifted closed, body finally relaxing into rest. It was as though she had heard and accepted the vow. Sierra glanced at Naomi. The older woman's face softened lines etched by years of care and hardship. Naomi said quietly, "You may have just taken on more than you realize." Sierra didn't flinch. "And then it's about damn time." Her gaze moved from Aurora to the foal nestled against her, and then to the dark window beyond the fire's reach. Somewhere in the frozen wilderness, answers waited. And she knew without doubt that Aurora would lead her to them. Morning in the Bitterroot Range was pale and brittle, the kind of light that seemed less like sunrise and more like frost, glinting on the edges of the world. The storm had passed, leaving the forest blanketed in crystalline silence. Snow crunched underfoot like shattered glass, hardened overnight into a crust that resisted each step. Inside Bear's Hollow Station, Sierra woke to the sound of hooves shifting restlessly. Aurora was pacing. The mare had given birth less than 12 hours before, yet she refused to lie still. She moved in slow, stiff circles near the hearth, ears flicking toward the door, nostrils flaring as though the wilderness outside still tugged at her. The foal lay in the small makeshift stall Sierra had built from spare lumber and blankets near the stove, warm and safe in the glow of firelight. But Aurora's body trembled, her head lifting toward the window again and again. Sierra crouched beside the foal, stroking the tiny muzzle, before glancing up at Naomi, who sat at the table scribbling notes. "She won't settle," Sierra said quietly. Naomi frowned. "She's just delivered. Her body needs rest." Then, watching Aurora's restless circling, she sighed. "But she thinks there's something unfinished." Aurora stopped at the door, pawed at the threshold, then turned, eyes locking on Sierra. Naomi shook her head. "You sure she's ready to move?" Sierra rose, pulling her jacket from the peg. She wouldn't be pacing like this if it wasn't important. Sierra prepared quickly, flashlight camera sidearm clipped at her hip, radio strapped to her shoulder. She patted the foal's stall with fresh hay, stroking the newborn once more. "Stay warm, little one. Mama and I have work to do." Naomi muttered something about stubborn rangers and impossible horses, but there was no stopping Sierra. She looped a rope loosely around Aurora's neck, not as a tether, but as guidance, and opened the door. The cold struck like a blade. The mare stepped out first, head-high breath, puffing in white clouds. She paused only long enough to scent the air before moving east into the shadowed wall of pines. The forest swallowed them. Snow lay deep between the trunks, muffling the world to a hush, broken only by the crunch of boots and hooves. Above, icicles hung from branches like rows of daggers glinting faintly in the weak morning light. Sierra followed each step, careful breath measured. Her senses stretched thin, aware of every shifting branch, every crow's wing cutting through the silence. Aurora did not falter. Her ears swiveled, her gait steady despite her exhaustion. For nearly an hour, they pressed deeper into the Bitterroot Range, climbing ridges and weaving through gullies until the trail narrowed into a rocky chute. Aurora halted abruptly. Sierra almost walked into her flank before realizing the mare had frozen nostrils, flared ears rigid. Ahead, a narrow cleft split the ridgeline. Fallen trees leaned across it, half concealing the gap, while boulders littered the entrance. To an untrained eye, it looked like nothing a deadfall, another scar in the mountain. But Sierra smelled it before she saw. A sour stench lingered in the air, metallic and rancid blood mingled with rot. Her stomach turned. Aurora whickered low, stepping back as though torn between dread and duty. Sierra squeezed her shoulder gently. "All right, girl? We'll see." They squeezed through the rocks into a hollow no larger than a farmhouse yard. Snow was trampled into dirt here, churned with mud and frozen blood. At the far end stood a crude corral posts driven haphazardly into the ground, welded bars of rusted steel strung between. Rope dangled from beams, chains lay coiled in the snow. The stench grew stronger. Sierra's light swept over dark patches where straw had been soaked and frozen. Tufts of hair clung to splintered wood. A battered feed trough stood empty, stained with filth. Aurora let out a strangled cry and backed away, ears flat, hooves stamping the ground. Sierra realized with a jolt this was where they had held her. Her flashlight caught something carved into one of the posts, the faint letters BP. The initials made her blood run colder. Boone Pike. She crouched lower, spotting a torn sack beneath the corral wall. She pulled it free, shaking snow loose. Inside were the remnants of veterinary supplies, a broken vial, syringes dulled by rust, a packet of anesthetic powder. Tools for subduing, not healing. Sierra snapped photo after photo. The corral, the ropes, the sack. Every image proof of what Aurora had endured. Proof this wasn't chance. The faint hum of an engine cut through the silence. Sierra froze, crouching low. The sound grew louder, nearer the distinct rattle of an ATV on frozen ground. She shoved Aurora back gently toward the cleft, gesturing for her to stay hidden, then darted behind a camouflaged tarp that sagged along the corral's far corner. Through the gap she watched. An ATV rolled into the hollow, its headlamp slicing a line across the snow. The rider dismounted, a tall, broad man in a black coat hood drawn low. A radio clipped to his shoulder crackled faintly. He carried a flashlight in one hand, a lighter in the other. Sierra's gut clenched. She knew that profile. Jonah Pike, Elias Boone's right hand, trouble-given form. He moved with the confidence of someone who belonged here, sweeping the flashlight over the corral. His voice carried low and irritable as he spoke into a phone. "Yeah, she's gone. Only blood left. Boss says torch it. No witnesses." Sierra's heart slammed. Her hand tightened around her camera. She flicked it to video mode, angling the lens through the gap. The red record light blinked. Jonah's words, his face, the scene, they were hers now. Evidence that no sheriff could ignore. Jonah pulled a jerry can from the ATV and began splashing fuel over the posts, the rancid scent of gasoline rising through the cold air. Sierra inched backward, fingers brushing her radio. She needed to call Dan or Naomi, anyone. A twig snapped under her boot. Jonah's head whipped around. "Who's there?" His flashlight beam stabbed across the hollow, slicing through shadows. He drew a hunting knife, advancing with quick, heavy steps. Sierra's pulse pounded. She crouched lower, gripping her sidearm, but holding her breath. Then the air split with a scream. Aurora stood framed in the ravine entrance, her silhouette backlit by the winter sun. She reared high hooves, striking the air, and let out a piercing whinny that ricocheted off the cliffs. The sound thundered through the hollow, rolling like a war cry. Jonah spun, cursing. The mare's fury filled the air, her body blocking the only exit. For a moment, he hesitated, knife clutched uselessly at his side. The sound alone could carry for miles. Someone might hear. Someone might come. He snarled, dropped the lighter, and bolted. He sprinted to the ATV, gunned the engine, and roared out of the hollow in a spray of snow. The gasoline smell lingered acrid and sharp. The corral still stood, though dark stains bled into the snow where he had poured. Sierra broke from cover breath, ragged. She ran straight to Aurora, throwing her arms around the mare's neck, burying her face in the damp coat. "You just saved my life," she whispered. Her hand trembled as she stroked Aurora's mane. The mare huffed, ears still pinned, but her body lowered back to earth. Sierra glanced toward the corral camera still clutched in her hand. The photos, the video, Jonah's words, they were more than scraps of evidence now. They were proof of a network. Proof Boone's men were still here. And proof that Aurora hadn't just led her to her own prison. She had led her to the heart of a crime. The night had settled like a heavy quilt over the Bitterroot Range. After the encounter in the hidden ravine, Sierra had returned to town with trembling hands and evidence heavy in her pockets, photographs, a recording of Jonah Pike's voice, and the acrid memory of gasoline still clinging to her coat. She had given her report to Sheriff Danner, who had listened with a grim expression, but said little beyond, "We'll need more." But even after she filed the evidence, even after Naomi reassured her that Aurora and the foal were safe in the cabin, Sierra couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't only the crime ring Boone was running, or the danger of Jonah slipping back into the woods. It was Aurora herself, of the mare's restlessness, the way she stared into the forest, as though she carried knowledge no one else could see. And so Sierra found herself following an old memory, riding through the brittle cold toward a cabin she hadn't visited in years. Alden Crow lived 10 miles from Darby, along a bend in the Bitterroot River, where the water sang under sheets of ice. His cabin stood low against the tree line, built from timber he had hewn himself. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, carrying the tang of oak and resin. Sierra dismounted at the fence, tied her horse, and crunched across the frosted ground. She knocked 3 times on the rough pine door. The door opened slowly, revealing a man who seemed more a part of the forest than its visitor. Alden Crow was nearly 70 tall, but stooped, his hair long and white, his beard braided in places where wood shavings had caught. His eyes, dark and steady, were like deep water reflecting light, but holding something older beneath. "I've been expecting someone," he said, his voice gravelly, carrying both humor and gravity. Sierra managed a tired smile. "It's been a long time, Mr. Crow." "Too long," he said, stepping aside. "Come in before the cold eats you alive." The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of herbs drying on rafters and cedar logs smoldering in the hearth. Tools lined the walls, chisels, planes, saws, each one worn smooth from decades of use. On a shelf above the fire, wooden carvings stood in rows, horses, eagles, salmon, each one etched with reverence. Crow set a kettle on the fire, poured steaming water over herbs in 2 mugs, and gestured to the table. "Sit. Tell me what brought you." Sierra pulled out her phone, thumbed to the photograph she had taken of Aurora the night before the mare, standing in the glow of firelight, sweat and snow still clinging to her hide. She slid it across the table. Crow studied it for a long moment. His brow furrowed, his lips moving silently, as though speaking to someone long gone. Finally, he exhaled. "You found her," he said quietly. "The memory mare." Sierra blinked. "The what?" He tapped the screen with a calloused finger. "That one isn't just any Mustang. She carries bloodlines older than most men in this valley, remember." Sierra leaned forward. "You know her, I know her kind," Crow said. His voice had taken on a cadence slow and deliberate, as though he were lifting the words from a place buried deep. "We called them Skelekekam. In my people's tongue, it means those who remember." He settled back the firelight, deepening the lines in his face. "My grandfather told me of them. Horses with tall frames and deep eyes, tougher than winter, faster than fear. Our people believed they carried memory in their bones of rivers, of mountains, of all who came before. They were not just beasts. They were living history. He pointed again at the photo. See the star on her brow. That mark is called the sign of return. It shows up once in a generation. My grandfather said it meant the land itself had chosen to send back a guardian. Sierra felt her throat tighten. She had noticed the faint white blaze between Aurora's eyes, but never thought it more than chance. Crow's eyes glistened as he continued. Her grandmother had the same mark. I saw her once many years ago before the men came with their trucks. They took her. We thought the line was lost. But now, he gestured toward the phone. Now she has returned. Sierra sat in silence, absorbing the words. It sounded like legend, the kind of story elders told to give weight to grief. Yet when she thought of Aurora, of the way the mare had guided her into the ravine of the intelligence burning behind her eyes, she found she could not dismiss it. Crow's voice dropped, softened by memory. You've seen the scars on her neck. You've seen the fear in her bones. That's not new. He leaned closer to the fire, staring into the flames as if they replayed a life only he could see. In the 1980s, there was a ring that hunted mustangs through these mountains. They built corrals hidden in ravines, baited them with hay, shot them with tranquilizers. They hauled them out under the cover of night, sold them downstate across borders. Some were slaughtered, some were forced into races or fights. It was a war against memory itself. Sierra's hand curled into a fist. I saw them once, Crow continued, his voice steady, but his eyes dark. 4 horses taken from the creek near my cabin. I could do nothing. I was young, without power. By the time the sheriff came, the trucks were gone. We never found the herd. He drew a slow breath. They caught some of the men, but never all. For every name cut down, another rose in the shadows. Always someone else waiting. The fire popped sharply, casting sparks. Crow didn't flinch. And now he said the pattern returns. The scars on your mare tell me she was theirs. But she escaped. And she came back not by accident, but by will. She is the thread they failed to sever. Crow rose from his chair, moving with the stiff care of age. He crossed to an old chest, lifted the lid, and rummaged through until he drew out a small strip of worn leather. At its end hung a tuft of horsehair, faded but still clinging. He carried it to Sierra, holding it with both hands as though it were fragile glass. This, he said softly, was from her grandmother, I believe. My father found it after she was taken. He kept it, said it was all that remained of her spirit. I have carried it these 40 years. Sierra reached out, fingers brushing the relic. The leather was cracked, the hair brittle, but it radiated something more than age, a weight of continuity, of grief and defiance. Crow's eyes fixed on hers. This mare is not just flesh and bone. She carries memory of land, of loss, of freedom. She's not meant to be sold or broken. She is meant to remind us. His voice grew firmer, echoing with the cadence of ceremony. We called them Ngek Kekam, the memory horses. To harm them is to harm the spirit of the bitter root itself. To guard them is to honor it. Sierra swallowed hard. She wanted to protest, to say she was only a ranger, that her job was simply to document and protect. But the word stuck. Because deep in her chest, she felt it too, the sense that Aurora's survival was no ordinary rescue. Crow pressed the leather into her palm. Tie this to her mane when the time comes. She'll know where she belongs. Silence stretched between them, filled by the crackle of fire and the distant rush of river under ice. Sierra stared at the relic in her hand, its weight far greater than its size. She thought of Aurora lying in the cabin, her foal pressed against her side. She thought of the whinny that had sent Jonah Pike running, the defiance in those dark eyes. It was no longer just a matter of protecting a single animal. It was about defending a lineage, a memory older than the town itself. Sierra lifted her gaze, voice steady but quiet. I'll protect her. Not just because she's evidence, not just because she's mine to care for, but because she's more. Crow's eyes softened. For the first time that evening, a faint smile tugged at his lips. Then she chose. Well, he said. Sierra rode back through the dark, with the relic tied to her wrist, the cold biting her cheeks, the stars burning bright above the mountains. She knew the path ahead would not be simple. Boone and his men were still out there. Sheriff Danner was cautious, and the law moved slow. But the memory of Crow's words lit something inside her, a fire she hadn't felt since the day she first put on the Ranger's badge. Aurora was more than a survivor. She was a story the land refused to let die. And now Sierra carried that story too. Sierra started at dawn, coffee gone cold on the dash, and the heater ticking against the mountain chill. She had spent half the night copying everything to a fresh USB drive. The photos of the rusted corral, the initials carved into the post, the anesthetic packets, and most damning, the video of Jonah Pike in the ravine, saying, "Boss says torch it." No witnesses. A second copy sat in her pocket, heat-sealed in a tiny plastic bag. Evidence didn't matter if it never reached a desk. The road out of Bears Hollow climbed steadily toward the pass, a ribbon of hardpack cutting between drifts that rose like white walls. 10 miles from town, the road rounded a blind curve and narrowed against a drop. That's where the black pickup appeared, parked sideways, blocking both lanes. Sierra braked hard. The truck slid a foot on ice and stopped. 2 men climbed out of the black pickup and came toward her, boots grinding the frozen gravel. She recognized the first by his narrow eyes and the dark tattoo peeking above his collar, Jonah Pike. Beside him walked Elias Boone, heavier in the shoulders hat. Low, the face she'd seen at county fairs and livestock auctions for years, always smiling, always shaking hands, always somehow a shade to the side of trouble. Boone's smile now was nothing like the public one. "Walk away, Ranger," he said, stopping just out of arm's reach. "These horses are ours, always have been." Sierra opened her door and stepped down, the wind biting clean through her jacket. Her hand hovered near her holster, not touching, not threatening, only there. "You're interfering with a federal investigation," she said. Jonah laughed once, short and ugly. "There won't be an investigation if there's no witness." He shouldered past her and yanked open the passenger door of her Ranger, rooting through the glove box and kit bag. Boone held her eyes as if daring her to move. "Grab the drive," he told Jonah. "We don't have time." Sierra shifted to block Boone when he reached for the center console. He shoved her. The edge of the door scraped her hip. In the next heartbeat, Jonah had her wrist twisting, forcing her chest down against the hood. The cold metal stole her breath. Boone's hand went into her bag and came up with a small zip-top pouch. He pinched the USB between 2 fingers like a dead fly and turned toward the drop-off. "Think fast," he said. Sierra jerked against Jonah's grip. His fingers tightened to pain. The pass went quiet for a half-second. The particular silence of danger then shattered on a sound that cut the air like a blade. A single ringing whinny echoed from above. They all looked up. At the lip of the slope stood Aurora, dark against the pale sky, steam puffing from her nostrils, ears flat. For a heartbeat, she was still, muscles coiled. Then she launched. She came down the bank like a thrown spear, snow exploding under her hooves. Boone turned too slow. Aurora struck him with her forelegs, one clean blow to the shoulder. He staggered, fell, and skidded on his back. The USB popped from his hand and pinged once on the road before spinning to a stop against Sierra's boot. Jonah flinched and released Sierra as Aurora surged past the grill. He drew a knife by reflex. The mare wheeled, tail lashing, and caught his face with the flat of her tail and the hard slap of her hip. He stumbled, blinking through tears. For a second, Jonah's bravado fell away, and the animal in him read the animal in her not prey. Sierra pushed off the hood, snatched the USB, and backed up. Boone swore and crabbed toward his truck. Jonah recovered eyes, cutting between the woman and the horse. He swore two breath coming fast and bolted for the driver's side. Aurora planted herself broadside between Sierra and the menhirs, pinned chest up, every line of her body warning. Her whinny rolled down the pass again, louder, longer, a sound that said, "Come and try it." Boone dove into the black pickup. Jonah slammed the passenger door. Tires spun, snow spat from under fenders. The truck fishtailed, found traction, and roared away around the bend. The pass went quiet, except for the ticking engine in Sierra's Ranger and the sound of her own blood in her ears. She sank to one knee, breath fogging. Aurora lowered her head, watching the empty road, then turned and nudged Sierra's shoulder as if to ask whether she intended to stand up now. Sierra let out a shaky laugh. You protected me." She rose and laid her hand on Aurora's neck. The mare's skin twitched under her palm, hot despite the cold. Sierra heard her own voice come out, hushed not with fear, but with recognition. "You weren't just wild. Someone trained you." She stepped back a half pace and on instinct tested a word she'd used 100 times with the gelding she'd lost. Back. Aurora shifted one step backward and stopped. "Stay." The mare went still, eyes on Sierra waiting. Sierra drew in a slow breath and let it go. "You were trained," she murmured. "But by who?" The wind combed the snow along the cut bank. The light had thinned to afternoon gray. Aurora flicked an ear and looked up the road where the black pickup had vanished. Sierra followed her gaze, then looked back at the USB clutched in her mitten. She no longer felt alone on that pass. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. She slipped the drive into the inner pocket of her jacket, patted it once, then patted the mare's shoulder. "Let's go finish this." Back in town, the sheriff's office smelled of melted snow and old paper. Sierra set the photos on Sheriff Danner's desk, then the bag of seized items from the ravine, then the USB. Danner plugged in the drive and watched the video. Jonah Pike's face under the headlamp, whom the words "Boss says" torch it. No witnesses. The sheriff didn't blink. Sierra added the rest. Rust flakes and hair from the cage, the initials on the post, the anesthetic packets, the tracks leading to service roads. Witness at the Sinclair station heard hooves thumping in a trailer at 3 in the morning. Boone and Jonah ambushed me on the pass. Danner's face shuddered with each new piece until he looked like the building itself, stone and wood and weather. He slid open the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a folder the color of old dust. He laid it down and brushed at the label with his thumb. EB, Suspicious Livestock Activity, 1994. Inside were reports from 20 years of Winter's calls from ranchers about strays gone missing, notes from wardens about cut fences, one faded Polaroid of a broken panel in a canyon no one used anymore. The pattern lived there, half seen always, a name short, always a witness late. "He's been hiding in plain sight for decades," Danner said, not quite to Sierra, not quite to himself. "Then we stopped waiting," Sierra said. The door opened, and Naomi swept in with her coat half-buttoned and urgency written across her face. "Word is Boone's planning to move the herd across state lines," she said. "Oregon buyers, black market, they'll be gone within 48 hours. That set the clock. Danner reached for the phone. Calls spun outward the FBI field office in Missoula, contacted BLM 2 wardens who knew the back roads better than maps did. In an hour, the sheriff had a warrant half-drafted and a list of names committed to the raid. He didn't like federal attention, and he didn't like to admit that a ranger and a vet had cornered the story before he did, but he liked Boone even less. They built the plan on the whiteboard. Target Boone spread west of Bitterroot, where he'd hidden behind the cover of quarter horses and hay sales. Primary objective: seize records, secure animals, arrest responsible parties. Teams: Team 1. To the main house, quiet and fast Danner, with 2 deputies and 2 FBI agents. Team 2 to the long, steel-sided building that passed for a machine shed, likely where holding pens would be. Team 3 to the low structures behind the ridge, old feed barns, the sort of place you used if you didn't want neighbors to hear. Sierra volunteered for Team 3. Naomi insisted on going where the animals were. The FBI agreed to embed an agent with them. Sierra checked and rechecked her kit: radio-charged spare batteries, headlamp cable cutters, gloves, a halter, and lead rope. She hesitated at the last addition, then slid it into her pack anyway. "We're taking Aurora," she said. Danner stared. A horse? Sierra didn't blink. She knows the smell of their pens. She'll find what we miss. In the end, Danner only grunted and signed the warrant. They rolled out after a full dark. No moon, no lights. Engines idled low, then clicked off a quarter-mile from Boone's fence line. Men and women stepped into cold so sharp, it felt clean in the lungs. Radios whispered. Metal snapped once and fell quiet as the bolt cutters worked. Team 1 peeled left toward the ranch house. A dog barked once and was hushed. Team 2 ghosted along the machine shed, black on black against corrugated steel. Sierra moved with Team 3 toward the back ridge, Aurora's breath pluming in slow white bursts at her shoulder. The mare shifted head high. She knew this place. Her body went rigid and then purposeful, not fear, not even anger, but recognition. "Easy," Sierra whispered. "We're with you." They reached the first of the low buildings, barn wood, weathered gray doors, chained a locked hasp that looked like it had been closed in a hurry. The FBI agent with them, Lopez, put a gloved finger to his lips and worked the bolt cutter jaws over the chain. One clean bite. The chain fell. Sierra eased the door inward. The smell hit first rank, sour, a mix of urine and rot and old fear. She snapped her headlamp on, and the beam found eyes. Dozens of eyes. Horses stood in cramped panels cobbled together out of pipe and plywood. Their hips jutted ribs like a washboard tails matted. Some had sores at the fetlocks where rope had once rubbed. A few had patches of skin gone raw. A murmur rose as the beam swept the low hum of animals too tired to spook and too hopeful not to look. Naomi made a soft sound, not quite a sob. They were starving them before transport, she said. "Open the panels," Lopez said quietly. "Slow and steady. Keep them calm." Sierra moved stall to stall, unhooking makeshift latches, talking in a low, even tone. "Easy. Easy, girl. You're okay." She slipped halters where she could improvise leads from rope where she couldn't. Naomi checked eyes and gums, pressed fingers against necks to find a pulse. Aurora stood just inside the door, head turned, breathing deep, counting. Outside, radio static popped, Team 1 breaching the house. Inside, metal screeched as Team 2 forced the machine shed doors. A minute later, the shed lights came on, revealing more pens, more horses' piles of feed sacks stacked for show and cameras. Boone, meanwhile, was in his office off the kitchen, hunched over a desktop tower, fingers so frantic on the keyboard that his hand slipped and knocked a coffee across the keys. By the time Danner and Agent Morales pushed through the door, he had the side panel off and was ripping at a drive bay. "Hands," Morales said, and Boone froze, a cornered man mid-sabotage. He looked up with that old fairground smile pasted back on. "You think people care about wild horses," he said. "No one's coming to save them." Morales took him by the wrist and turned him to the wall. Tonight they did. They walked him out onto the porch. Flood lamps had gone on across the property. Headlights lined the fence line where more vehicles had arrived. Animal control, a reporter from the county paper who'd been tipped to wait down the road, 2 elders from the tribes council who had heard whispers and decided to stand there when it finally broke. Cameras clicked. Boone squinted. Danner read the warrant into the wind anyway. Back at the back barns, horses shuffled into the yard, one by one blinking into the cold, with a kind of stunned relief. Sierra moved among them. A mare leaned into her chest a fraction. A gelding pushed his nose into Naomi's shoulder and left it there. Aurora stayed close to the barn door, head turning with each sound beyond the ridge. "Hold on," Sierra said, noticing the way the mare's ears pricked. "She's not done." A shadow moved at the far edge of the yard. Jonah Pike, hatless, no coat, half-buttoned, slipped out a side door and trotted low toward the tree line. He thought the racket at the house would hold every eye. He thought wrong. He thought... Aurora's head snapped left. She let out a call, unlike the earlier war cry, short, sharp, targeted. Sierra's radio hissed. "Movement east fence," she said into it. "Runner." Lopez and a deputy broke into a sprint. Sierra followed the ground uneven and crusted with old snow. Jonah cut through the willow brake, slid down a creek bank, and splashed into water too cold to register. He made it nearly 200 yards before the brush thickened and the creek narrowed into a rocky slot in the same place Sierra had first heard a whinny in the blizzard. They took him there. He went face first into snow and stayed when the deputy's knee found the center of his back. Handcuffs clicked. Jonah spat mud and curses that steamed in the cold. No one replied. They hauled him up the bank and marched him past the yard lights toward the house. He kept his eyes down, not on the cameras or the agents, but on the horse standing by the barn door, watching like a witness. Captures were for paper, for Asar. The work still waited. "Count again," Sierra told Naomi, breath-fogging. "Make sure we have them all." They didn't. The head count came up short by 1, a stallion the locals had whispered about for years, the old lead who'd kept a band out of the worst draws and taught colts the fast way through shale. Sierra had never seen him up close, only the shadow at distance. Naomi's jaw tightened when she read the list. If Boone had him, he didn't keep him in the open. Aurora shifted. She started to walk not toward the pasture, not toward the trailers, but away from the noise along the ridge and down behind a berm where snow had drifted deep. Sierra matched her stride the lead rope slack. The mare stopped at a squat shed half buried against the hill. The door was new. The padlock was newer. Lopez Sierra called. "Here." He jogged over, set the cutters, and snapped the shackle. The door stuck and then tore free with a groan of wood. Cold air rolled out. And then the smell sweat and old boards and the flat scent of an animal too long penned. Sierra switched on her headlamp and raised it. 2 eyes reflected back red with the light. A head lifted. A neck arched, the line still noble even in starvation. The old stallion stepped forward 1 careful pace, bones sharp under hide, everything about him still dignified. Naomi's breath hitched. "It's him," she whispered. "The old lead stallion." She came back for him. Aurora took another step and reached out, touching her forehead gently to the stallion's neck. He stood and let it happen. No sound passed between them, but something moved. A bar lifted, a weight set down. Sierra felt the hair rise along her arms, despite the heat of her jacket. "Easy, old man," Sierra said. "You're coming out." They took the panel apart piece by piece so he wouldn't panic at a sudden squeeze. He stepped into the yard slow, each foot placed thoughtfully. The other Mustangs went quiet for a breath, then started to murmur tiny sounds, recognition traveling like wind. Lights moved across the property. Paperwork began in earnest. Deputies sealed rooms, bagged drives, tagged syringes and ropes and ledgers. An animal control team backed a trailer to the gate, fresh hay waiting inside. The elders from the council stood side by side at the fence, hands folded, eyes fixed on the horses, emerging into starlight. Boone was in the back of a cruiser, now cuffed jaw, set in a way that meant he was calculating lawyers' phone calls, the slow churn of a system he'd counted on. Jonah sat 2 cars down with a bruise blooming on his cheekbone and silt drying on his lips. Sierra leaned into Aurora's shoulder. The mare's body had softened. Her ears were forward, not searching anymore, but simply listening. The stallion lowered his head and nosed the snow, the gesture of an animal tasting air he recognized. "We've got you," Sierra said, not sure whether she meant the horses or the valley or herself. "We've got you." She checked the time. Hours had passed, and yet the night felt suspended, and the world narrowed to breath clouds and hoof prints, steam drifting up from damp coats under floodlight. When she finally looked at the horizon, she saw the faintest smear of gray where the ridge cut the sky. Morning creeping up on their work. "Load them slow," Naomi said to the handlers. "Small groups. Warm water on the trailers. We do this right." The handler nodded and started the sequence. The first pair stepped up the ramp without a push. The second took coaxing. The stallion glanced once at Aurora. She stepped beside him shoulder to shoulder, and he went up with her, solid and calm. Sierra closed the latch and rested both hands on the warm metal. Around her, voices rose and fell and boots squeaked on snow. Radios clicked, pens emptied. Some problems in the world only hollowed you out the longer you looked. This one tonight had given something back. Aurora lifted her head into the cold and let out a single, unhurried whinny. Not alarm, not command. A simple announcement into the dark: "We are here." "Yeah," Sierra said, smiling despite the ache in every muscle. "We are." News traveled faster than hooves could ever run. Within 48 hours of the raid on Boone's ranch, photographs swept across Montana and beyond. Mustangs staggering out of shadowed barns, ribs like washboards. Deputies leading them through snowdrifts. And at the center, a single image: Ranger Sierra Cole Head, bowed against the wind, guiding a dark mare with eyes sharp as flame. Aurora. The state papers ran the story above the fold. National outlets picked it up with words like trafficking and federal bust. On social media, the image of Aurora and Sierra was shared with captions that made even strangers pause. Not all guardians wear badges. Some are born with hooves. In Darby, a town where most winters were too long and most paychecks too thin, something stirred. Residents drove out to the holding pens on the edge of town to see the Mustangs for themselves. They carried hay bales, buckets, even old quilts sewn by grandmothers. School children painted signs and taped them along the wire fences: "Let them run free." Freedom riders, not for sale. On weekends, teenagers hammered together rough shelters from scrap lumber. A group of young men camped beside the corrals at night, rotating shifts to keep the weakest horses blanketed and fed. The town had been given a wound to look at, but also a chance to heal it together. Naomi Fletcher walked the rows every morning with her stethoscope and her worn leather satchel. Bandages and shots helped, but her voice carried further. "We need more than first aid," she told the crowd one cold dawn. "These animals need permanence, a sanctuary." Sierra stood beside her, exhausted but listening. She had lived most of her life on assignments that ended when the fire was out or the trail closed. The word sanctuary felt heavier, longer, like a promise you didn't walk away from. The answer came from Alden Crow. The carpenter appeared one evening carrying nothing but an old map and a thermos of pine tea. 100 acres, he said, tapping the paper. Bitterroot's Edge by the sacred stream. It belonged to my father's father. It still belongs to them. The room fell silent. Alden's land was known for its water meadows and the wide bend where salmon turned. To give it away was no small thing. He poured his tea, sipped once, and added, "You've rescued bodies. Now give them back their spirit." So they set to work. Bitterroot Mustang Sanctuary was inked onto paperwork and then carved into wood. Crow swung his axe as if he were young again, splitting timbers and raising beams with hands scarred from decades at the lathe. Naomi designed a barn with warm stalls and a treatment wing. Sierra took to the phones calling wildlife groups, rescue associations, anyone who would listen. Volunteers arrived with trucks, fence posts, and a surprising amount of stubborn joy. Through March winds and April mud, the project grew. By the third month, a great pasture stretched open under the mountains, enclosed by rails of raw pine. Beside it stood a low barn, cedar-shingled and steady smoke from its chimney curling like a welcome. At the gate, they planted a sign, letters cut by Crow's chisel, "Aurora's Haven, where the wild runs free." The mare herself grew strong with the season. The scars at her neck vanished beneath a thicker coat, her stride evened, and her eyes took on a clear brightness that made people step back when they first saw her. When she was released into the pasture on the morning of the sanctuary's opening, she paused a long moment. The crowd watched in silence. Her breath clouded in the cool air. Then Aurora lifted her head and let out a cry so sharp it seemed to split the sky. The herd answered. Horses that had been thin shadows weeks before now raised their heads, ears forward, and followed her. At her flank trotted her foal, awkward still, learning the world. And behind him, the old stallion rescued from Boone's shed, carrying himself with weary dignity. Together, they moved across the grass, not in panic, not in hunger, but in choice. Aurora led them in a broad arc, a line of motion, unbroken, as if she were sketching freedom into the earth itself. Sierra stood at the fence, hands curled around the rail. For one breath, Aurora's dark gaze turned back, locking with hers. It was not gratitude nor submission. It was recognition you kept your promise. Then the mare surged forward, and the herd thundered behind her. Some of the onlookers wiped their eyes without shame. Others simply stood still, unsure why their chests felt larger, why the air seemed lighter. Watching Aurora was not like watching an animal run. It was like seeing something return that the land had been missing. Summer came soft that year. On a morning bright with dew, Sierra sat on the fence line of the sanctuary, a mug of coffee warming her palms. The pasture before her was alive, foals kicking clumsily, mares grazing in slow arcs, the stallion standing guard at a knoll. In the center of it all was Aurora Maine, lifting in the breeze, her foal circling her legs in play. Crow joined her carrying his axe, though there was no work for it. He leaned against the rail's silver beard, catching the light. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was full, not empty. Finally, he said almost to the wind itself, "Sometimes the land sends us a guardian." And she came with hooves. Sierra's eyes stayed on Aurora. She thought of the storm of the snow piled high against the cabin of the moment when she had whispered, "You're not dying out here. Not tonight." So much had changed since then, yet the promise still felt present, still binding. She smiled softly. "And I think she's home now." Aurora lifted her head at that instant, as if catching the words across the field. She whinnied once, clear, bright enough to carry across the sanctuary. The foal kicked its heels and ran a circle around her. Behind them, the herd grazed in peace tails, swishing in the summer light. The picture fixed itself in Sierra's mind: the mare, the foal, the stallion, the herd, the green sweep of Bitterroot rising beyond. No fences in sight, only rails that bent with the land, only freedom written where it had been stolen. The story would be told and retold of corruption uncovered of a ranger and a mare who refused to quit, of a community that chose to heal what had been broken. But Sierra knew the truth was simpler. It was here in the quiet morning, in the sight of Aurora standing tall beneath a wide sky. It was the knowledge that some battles end not with arrests or signatures, but with the sound of hooves running free.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.